Now, welcome back to another session. I hope you were well. Now, in the session that I was covering previously, I was talking about the importance of learning how to stand guard and exclude certain experiences you may have had, certain emotions you may have bonded with, and certain, you might say, uh, maybe generational trauma, thoughts, concerns that you've inherited and carried over. And I tried in the session prior to encourage you to learn how to let go. Just let go of the past. Your past will control your future until and unless you decide to dump it, or until or unless you decide to forget it. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should simply divorce yourself from all of your past experiences. No, I think the memory is there as an intellectual faculty to serve a purpose. With our imagination, we can pre-play a future that has never been or has never existed. We can pre-play a future that does not exist. With our memory, we can use our imagination to replay an experience that we once participated in. So our memory is there for a reason to file and to store information. When we have emotions that are very strong based on a lived experience, those are the most, you might say, easily filed in our memory. So whenever we have a similar occurrence, we go back into our memory and we bring to the screen of our imagination a similar experience. That only happens if we assign a strong emotion. And so one of the things we have to do is, by choosing not to remember or replay or discuss or regurgitate something wrong that may have happened to you, some way that you may have been identified, you remove the power that that emotion or experience has, and so it becomes a distant memory. Now, but in today's session, I like to move forward because I made reference to something that I think is necessarily so, which is the mind cannot be absent a thought. You're either moving towards a thought or you're moving away from a thought. By standing guard at the gate of your mind and by controlling the memories you bring into your imagination, that is one aspect of the equation. It's still incomplete. The second half is you have to give the mind something to look towards. You have to give the mind a picture, an idea, a hope, a dream, a vision to keep it occupied. Right, so the key question in today's session is, how can you use your imagination to reconstruct the image you have of yourself as someone who is depressed and anxious and worried and no good and has nothing to be proud of? How can you re-engineer that image you have of yourself in your imagination? We have never, and most people would agree to this statement, we have not been taught how the mind works. We are not taught at a young age, and we are not taught even as adults. Now, this means for most people, we tend to learn in life and try things by guesswork. Now, trying by guesswork achieves less than optimal results. Thinking is the highest form that we are capable of, but very few of us are taught how to think. Very few of us are taught how the mind works. Most people do not even know, and I say this respectfully, especially when I discuss with medical professionals. Most medical professionals, even psychologists and psychiatrists, are not aware that the mind and the brain are not synonymous. The mind is not the same as the brain. Most professionals understand how the brain works because we can point to the brain. We can see the two halves of the brain. It's been studied, it's been analyzed, there's been so much written about it. So we can pick any animal or mammal and we can identify where the brain is in the body. You cannot find your mind in your body because your mind doesn't exist in the body. Now, let me say that again. You cannot find where the mind is in your body because your mind does not exist in the body. We've been taught how the senses work. We understand our sensory faculties. Very few of us are taught that we have intellectual faculties. And it is our intellectual faculties that enable us have control over our environment, but even more importantly, that gives us control over our emotions. So whatever emotions you feel or experience on a day-by-day basis, it's not the emotion itself that matters. The emotion is simply a symptom of an underlying cause. The emotion is an effect. And therefore, if there's a way you do not feel, if there's a way you feel but you're not happy with that, the key thing is not, how do I change my emotions? Wrong. The question should be, how do I change and use my intellectual faculties better? And those intellectual faculties range. I made reference to some of them. Imagination, we talked about. Memory, I've mentioned. Perception is another one. Your will or your focus, ability to focus, and intuition. And there are more intellectual faculties that we have. And the way we use each of those faculties regulates and determines our emotional state and the emotions we feel. I can sit here now and in the screen of my imagination, if I were to shut my eyes, I could pull up to the screen of my imagination my mother's face. And I can go into my memory and remember how she loved and cared for me. And I can hear her voice vividly in my imagination. And within a few seconds, my vibration, my resonance, my frequency, my feelings will change. I would move into a state of love and admiration simply by using my intellectual faculty. I've combined imagination with memory. Now, similarly, I can have something happen to me that I'm not happy with, and I can go into my perspective or my perception, and I can, like a coin, every coin has three sides. You have the head, you have the tail, you have the edge. Most people stand on one side, and so that's all they see. So when life happens, rather than recognize that there's something called the law of polarity or the law of opposites, that there is, in every negative, there is a positive. Now, you may not know, and you may not be able to distinguish which it is, but it exists. Absent a positive, there cannot be a negative, and vice versa. And because people do not understand that you have to have the ability to stand on the edge of the coin, which is what perception really is, or perspective, so that you can see things from a different perspective. And it puts life in the right checks and balances. You lose a loved one. That's a huge loss. I have. And as hard as it might be to say, you have to say there's something that I may not know, sometimes that I need not know, that is good about the experience. I digress. Some time ago, I went to, I had the opportunity to be with a number of people. And I made the same sentence to a group. And someone didn't take too kindly with that statement. If you lose a loved one, it's a negative experience. It's hurtful, it's painful. And I said, well, we as humans, because we lack awareness, we do not always know what the good is. There's always a gem hidden in the experience. And the person took very unkindly to the fact that there was a positive associated with death or loss of a loved one. And I tried to explain, but I realized that I couldn't, because I was doing a very poor job in articulating what I meant. And similarly, I will do a poor job in articulating it here. But the point I made was as follows. And I'll use the person's experience to address the message itself. The person described how they had lost their mother. Now, keep in mind, this person was in their mid-50s to late 50s, but they were so vivid about how hurt they were. At the time, the mother died, the mother must have been about 85 plus, give or take. Now, two things came to mind. We are promised 30 years and 10. This person had lived. But when they explained further that their mother had suffered for about 15 years prior to her death, her suffering was unbearable. I mean, absolutely unbearable. The hospitals were not very helpful, but she was suffering for about 15 years. And the last years that she had on this earth were horrific. I mean, she was in agony. And I could see how a child might say, well, I wasn't ready for my mother to go. But I could also see how life and death are one and the same. There really is no death, to be honest. There is just life. We move and we transition from one form to another. Because spirit, which is what we are, spiritual beings, we have an intellect, and we use that intellect in a way that allows us to control our environment, but we live in bodies. And therefore, the death of the body is not the death of the spirit. The spirit lives on. But yes, it's the departure of the body from this physical plane, and it's the last time we get to interact with that body. But I could see at the same time how, in many ways, the suffering came to an end for the mother at the point of her death, physical death. But the suffering began for the child following the departure of the mother. And so the key question, if you think about this, because the person in question was suffering from depression, the key question is, well, if you are self-centered and if you're looking just to yourself and you're thinking about what's the sense of my loss, what have I lost? It would be remiss of me to say you've lost nothing. Of course you've lost something. You've lost a loved one. You've lost the ability to love. You've lost the memories that you once shared. But if you were humble enough and gentle, and then you could look from the other side and say, well, whilst mum was here for the past 20 years, she suffered. She was in agony. I could not take away her suffering. And so as much as I hate her departure, there is something to be said that she's no longer suffering wherever she is. Is that death's hold on her body was stopped at the point of her death. Hence the whole idea about there's always a positive. Now, think about it this way. We as humans, we're reviewing how things play out. I mean, the arrogance, as though we know better. I tend to believe that there is an intelligence that exists, and this intelligence is controlling, working with us, but that there is something bigger, like a tapestry. We are simply a small piece. And so if you look focused simply on that small piece, it's possible to say, woe is me. But if you were to just take a broad position and step out of yourself and say, maybe, just maybe, there's a grand plan. And this grand plan is beyond how I feel, or what I want, and my selfish desires. By just shifting yourself out of the picture, what you do is you transfer and you transfigure yourself from someone who is always expecting to someone who is accepting. Now, you have to understand that if you don't try, and by try I'm referring to using your imagination, it goes without saying, you would achieve nothing. We're not taught how to use our imagination, but we should try. The key question is, how do you try? Now, in the sessions to follow, I will address the whole process of trying in a manner that is not just theoretical. It has to be practical in a manner that you can use. But let me leave you with the following. You can use your imagination like a flight simulator. You can practice. You can practice and you can get really good at imagining and creating new pictures and visions. In the UK and in the West and in the United States, most people do not realize that almost 95% of all flight training, in other words, pilots and training to fly these huge machines, Most of the training is done on flight simulators. Yes, if you're driving and you're learning how to drive a bike, you use a bike. If you're driving and you're learning how to drive a car, you use a car. A bus, you use a bus. But when it comes to airplanes, especially big airplanes, you do not use a plane. You use a flight simulators. And these simulators are so good, and the modules are so exquisite, that it's just as good as using a normal plane. The point of this is that your imagination is like a flight simulator, and you can use your imagination and you can practice with your imagination, and you can see yourself performing perfectly through practice and consistent repetition, to the point where you're always focusing on the future. You're living in the present, but you're allowing yourself to draw you into the future, and you're focused less on the past. Now, this is partly why in the great writings it says that unless you become like children, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. The whole purpose of that was to simply say, children know how to use their imaginations. They sit out there and they're just dreaming and thinking about all the great things, and they come up to mum and they say, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be this. And mum says, well, we can't afford 2 meals a day. You can't afford to go to medical school. But the child can see themselves. And the key question is, if you can see yourself, you can do it.